Okay, well, thanks for coming to hear this lecture. I've been catching up with the recent FRUNI lectures, and though on very different topics from very different disciplines, they had at least this in common, that they introduced a coherent body of knowledge. They were filled with information. They opened my eyes to both disciplines, ideas, and actual facts that I'd had no idea of before. I wish I could promise you the same thing this evening. I hope that some of that will happen. I'm not entirely sure, and though sometimes I like to think that, or I like to say that this is an aspect of my discipline. It's an aspect of English literary studies that we don't promise hard facts and cast iron narratives in the way that some other disciplines can. Most of the time I think it's probably just me. And that the first thing I do when I see a sort of open and shut case is to try to find some hole in it. And the first thing I do when I see a fact is run in the other direction. So we'll just have to see how this goes. What I'm going to be talking about in this evening's lecture is, first of all, and last of all, Shakespeare's play, Richard III. I'm also going to be talking about the real Richard III, his material and other remains, and the relationship there might be between that historical and archaeological fact of Richard III, the 15th century king, and what was left after his reign was over, and Shakespeare's play, as it was written in the late 16th century, and as it has come down to us today. I'm conscious of, and we'll be talking about developments that are happening very thick and fast at the moment on the archaeological side of things. And part of what I'd like to think about, and maybe we might discuss in the questions period, is how the recent archaeology of Richard III might come to impact our understanding of his play. In a broad sense, I suppose, what this lecture is getting at is a triangular relationship between literature, time, or what you might call temporality, and matter, material objects. Time, matter, and literature, and how they get wound around each other in strange ways, not least in Shakespeare. So I start off with an image of a performance of Shakespeare's play, one created in the 18th century, more than a century after Shakespeare wrote Richard III. This is Hogarth's famous portrait of the actor Garrick playing Richard III. And you can see that he appears to be on a real battlefield. The boundaries between drama and reality, the material world, are very thin here. Maybe that's a set in the background, a painted set with those distant tents on it, or maybe he's really supposed to be on the battlefield. But what I want to draw your attention to is that he's surrounded by objects. He's surrounded by armor that lies at his feet, flowers that seem to have been strewn on the ground, maybe as a symbol of wasted hopes. He has in his hand a sword or a dagger. Behind him, there's the crown of England. There's a devotional image, a crucifix, from which he is notably turned away. And he's sitting on a bed inside of his tent, though it seems almost like a sort of four-poster bed with curtains somehow planted in the middle of a battlefield. Why am I dwelling on these objects? Because they're there in the place of what we ought to be seeing at this moment in the play. This is a moment in the play when Richard, the murderous, ambitious, almost diabolical usurper of the throne, who has killed and deceived his way to the crown of England and is now about to face his fate and his death on Bosworth Field when the sun comes up, the sun that you can already see rising in the distance. This is the moment in Shakespeare's play when he's awakening from a dream of vengeful ghosts, when the ghosts of those who have met their deaths at his hands or at his command come back to wish vengeance upon him and tell him that he will die on the field in the following morning. And he awakes in terror. This seems to me either the moment that he's just woken up, or maybe when he's supposed to be still seeing the ghosts. He has a sort of deeply haunted expression. But there are no ghosts in the portrait. What there are, instead, are objects. And what I want us to think about is part of this relationship between literature and materiality and temporality is the way in which objects can be almost like ghosts, the way in which objects can haunt us, can embody the past in the present, can create small centers of temporal disruption, if you like, in which the past is very present. All of the objects that you see here are objects which have served as props in the play Richard III. His sword, his crown, these have all been very significant, and all, in one sense or another, have blood on them. So there's almost a sense in which it's the objects, it's the past as embodied in matter that's come back to haunt him at this moment, that's taking the place of the ghosts. And the first story I want to tell involves precisely how an object can carry the past inside itself and come back to haunt the present. This is a story from Shakespeare's own time, though there's no way of knowing whether this story was known to him. It's a story about an inn in Leicester, the Blue Boar Inn, an inn in which Richard III was said to have spent the last night of his life before riding forth from Leicester to meet his fate on Bosworth Field. Whether there's any truth to the idea that Richard spent a night in the Blue Boar Inn, I don't know. It's not clear whether he actually spent the night in Leicester or in a tent on the battlefield. But the story was, down through the 16th century, down into the reign of Elizabeth, that he had stayed there, and moreover, that he had left something behind, a great cumbersome wooden bedstead in which Richard himself lay before the fight, gilded and with planks or cords at the bottom. It might seem odd that you would travel with your bed. You know, was Richard so finicky about his sleeping arrangements that he wouldn't simply take the bed that was available in the inn? He brought his bedstead with him everywhere he went? Possibly. Anyhow, this was the story that was told at the Blue Boar Inn. They certainly, the emphasis on there being planks or cords at the bottom emphasizes that this is an old-fashioned bed, not the kind of bed in which Elizabethans would have slept if they had their choice. It's an old bed and a pretty much neglected piece of furniture in the Blue Boar Inn. Until one day, maybe in the 1580s or the 1590s, the landlord's wife, Mrs. Clark, made a very surprising discovery. His wife, going one day to make up a bed they had placed in it, that is, the mattress they'd placed on the bedstead, in stirring of it, found a piece of gold to drop from it, and then upon search perceived the bedstead to have a double bottom, all which space between the two bottoms was filled with gold and treasure, all coined before Richard III's time or by him. Aha! From whence this Clark reaped an incredible mass of wealth. So clearly the implication here, all the coins are at least as old as Richard III's reign, so it must have been his treasure. He must have been traveling, the miserly king that he was, with his treasure, and hidden it in the bedstead, expecting to come back for it from Bosworth Field, except, of course, that he never returned. So the story seems to have a happy ending. The landlord, Mr. Clark, becomes very wealthy, and he goes on to become the mayor of Leicester. But the conclusion is not quite so cheering. After Mr. Clark's death, it is said that Mrs. Clark was murdered by her own maidservant for the wealth that had been in the bedstead. And though we don't know whether the story of the bedstead is true at all, there are some things that we know. That a man was hanged and the maidservant was burned for the murder of Mrs. Clark in the first decade of the 17th century. And by that time, or within a couple of years after that, the bed had become a tourist attraction. It was listed among the sights that you could see for a penny in England, along with the memorials in Westminster Abbey and Merlin's Cave in Wales. You could go to Leicester and see King Richard's bed. This is from a text of 1611, I think. So clearly, whether or not there was any money in that bedstead to begin with, there was money to be made out of it by a tourist industry in the early 17th century. Why does this matter? What I'm interested in about this story is precisely the way that matter can carries something of the past in it that spills, that erupts into the present with unpredictable consequences at unpredictable times. For most of the 16th century, that bed was a neglected piece of furniture. No one thought much about it. Then it suddenly became very significant, and part of that significance involved creating a very close relation, suddenly, between the late 16th century and that time 100 years previous when Richard III had passed through. Now, I'm showing you an image of the bed here. It's not the bed. This is not the bed that was at the Blue Boar Inn. We know that because this bed, which is displayed today in a manor house in Leicester as King Richard's bed, actually turns out to be a bed of the mid-17th century. In other words, this is a bed that was made in response to the story I've just told you, possibly actually designed to capitalize upon that story, or to fill the place of the bed which had somehow gone missing, the real Richard III's bed, whether or not it was really his. There are two morals I want to draw from this. Well, morals is a strong word. We don't have any morals in English, really. We just have notions. There are two notions I'd like to advance on the basis of this sorry tale. The first is precisely what I've been trying to get at about time not always being quite the linear, progressive, predictable motion from the past into the future that we normally think of. That there is such a thing as what the Shakespeare critic Jonathan Gill Harris has called untimely matter, which is to say, matter, objects that somehow put the present into very close and sometimes uncomfortable contact with the past. An image that sums this up very well is of time as a handkerchief that when it's smoothed out involves a steady progression from one end to the other, but that can be folded or crumpled or pleated in such a way that suddenly one temporal moment comes into close contact with another. That's an image that I owe to the French philosopher Michel Serres, who says an object, a circumstance, is polychronic, multi-temporal, and reveals a time that is gathered together with multiple pleats. So if you look at that the sheet, that blue satin sheet that's spilling off Richard's bed in the Hogarth painting, note how it's folded and crumpled, and parts that would normally be far apart on that sheet when it was spread out on the bed are suddenly in close contact. There are ways in which time works that way, I'm going to argue. There are ways in which suddenly an object or a play can put us into close contact with a moment that otherwise would seem irretrievably distant in the past. The second moral or notion that I want to draw from this opening story is precisely that, that phenomenon of the object that comes into being in response to a story, which is kind of the opposite of the way we normally think of things working in the Newtonian world, anyway, the world of Newtonian physics. There's matter, there's objects, we understand them, we understand the basic material foundations of existence, and then we weave stories and narratives on the basis of this pre-given material world. But can it work the opposite way? That's something that the Argentinian writer, the great 20th century Argentinian writer Jorge Luis Borges, plays with in one of his short stories, Tlon Ucbar Orbis Tertius. I won't try to explain even the title of this incredibly sort of complex and paradoxical story, but he imagines a world in which the relationship between objects and stories is effectively reversed, in which what he calls idealism actually allows ideas to bring objects into being. He gives the example that in the ancient regions of Tlon, the duplication of lost objects is not infrequent. Two persons look for a pencil. The first finds it, but says nothing. The second finds a second pencil, no less real, but closer to his expectations. That is, the desire to find the pencil has actually brought the pencil into being. Now, this is, a weird speculative short story by an Argentinian writer. What has it got to do with matter and Richard III? what I want to argue in this lecture as my second notion is that stories really do, if not bring matter into being, which, you know, I'd probably be sort of fired from my job in the university if I started advancing such completely heretical notions, but at least can bring matter to light, can cause change in the material world, which might mean, for instance, finding or making, happening upon, remembering the real story about a bed which aligns this 17th century bed that you see on the screen with a story about a 15th century bed, much to the profit of the people who get to display it today. Or it could mean other sorts of discoveries. And that's what brings me to what you might call the elephant or the skeleton in the room. I don't know how many of you tuned in at some point today to hear the news of the confirmation of the team at Leicester University that they have, in fact, unearthed and more or less conclusively identified the body of Richard III. We knew from a range of historical texts that he seemed to have been buried in the Leicester Greyfriars, and little more was known about his fate. Some stories said he'd subsequently been dug up and thrown in the river. His fate remained something of a mystery until last summer, an excavation partly funded by the Richard III Society, which is not insignificant. People who have a story they want to tell about Richard III helped bring this object to light in the summer of 2012. And as of today, thanks to DNA testing, carbon dating, identification of the kinds of wounds the body had received, and various other tests, they feel prepared to say that they have in fact discovered the remains of Richard III, which had been missing for more than 500 years. Now, what you see there is the evidence of a body that seems to have been deposited hastily and haphazardly into its grave. I'm not going to go over this evidence in any great detail. My lecture is more about literature than archaeology. But you can see his head is sort of sticking up from the bed of the grave. He seems to have been almost thrown into a hastily dug grave and quickly covered over. The body did reveal a number of things about Richard III. Some of them we had suspected, others not. It turns out he had a fairly severe spinal deformity, scoliosis, which they seem to be able to tell developed in adolescence. It would have caused him some pain. It would have made one shoulder higher than the other, which a number of early texts attest to, that his shoulders were of unequal height. He was not, however, the hunchbacked figure with the withered arm that Shakespeare, among others, present to us in his play. He would have been certainly capable of fighting in battle, which is, after all, how he died. There's evidence of exactly how he died in the images of the skull that were, again, released in this press conference this morning. You can see the massive hole that's been carved out of the base of his skull. This accords, it turns out, exactly with what early ballads belonging to the 10 years after Richard's death said about the way that he died, that his helmet was knocked off and he was, they dang on him as they were wood. That means basically they beat him like mad until his brains came out with blood, in the words of one of the early ballads. And you can see just where that happened. So now we know. So now we know. What do we know that we didn't know before, and how, as I've been asking myself and other people have been asking me in the course of this day, how does it affect our understanding of Shakespeare's play and its relationship to the real Richard III? Well, one story that you see a lot in the media coverage of this discovery of Richard III's body is that now we know that Shakespeare got it wrong, or maybe more strongly, now we know that Shakespeare was a liar a propagandist, a tool of the Tudor government, creating this monstrous image of Richard III in order to please Queen Elizabeth and the ideology of the day at the expense of a king who wasn't like that. Now, this opposition, this dichotomy that you encounter in so much of the press these days when they're covering the story of Richard III, this opposition between Shakespeare's dramatic false fiction and archaeological truth, on the other hand, is one that makes me a bit uneasy, especially when they seem to extrapolate things from it which don't seem evident to me at all. For instance, that, now that we've found Richard III, now that we have him, does it prove anything about whether he was responsible for the deaths of the princes in the Tower? No, it doesn't. But a lot of the coverage has suggested that somehow this is going to redeem his historical reputation from Shakespeare's lies. It's not quite as simple as that, is it? And Shakespeare's play, to get really to the heart of what I want to talk about, the relationship of Shakespeare's play to the historical facts about Richard III and the remains of Richard III's reign and person that were left in Shakespeare's time 100 years later. That relationship isn't nearly as straightforward as Shakespeare was a propagandist and a liar. Now, Shakespeare was a propagandist and a liar. I'm not denying that. And you see that in the very first soliloquy of the play. You see precisely the way that the image of the deformed, hunchbacked, withered-armed, I could sort of lope all around the theater like this, the way Olivier did it or the way Anthony Sher did it, how this is being constructed far removed from what the archaeology is showing us. Shakespeare makes the deformity the essence of Richard's character, and given that most of the deformity is made up, that might imply that the essence of Richard's character in Shakespeare's play is made up as well. Just to give you a sense of what he says about Richard, or what Richard is made to say about himself in the play. I that am not shaped for sportive tricks, nor made to court an amorous looking-glass. I that am rudely stamped, and want love's majesty to strut before a wanton ambling nymph. I that am curtailed of this fair proportion, cheated of feature by dissembling nature, deformed, unfinished, sent before my time into this breathing world, scarce half made up, and that so lamely and unfashionable that dogs bark at me as I halt by them. And he goes on to say, as you can see there, that being so cut off from the common run of humanity by his extreme deformity, he cannot prove a lover. He cannot participate in the amorous and decorous pursuits of the court in peacetime. And so he is determined to prove a villain. And of course, there's a pun there that every reader of Richard III, ought to be aware of. A pun between I am determined to prove a villain, like it is my will, I have a plan to be a villain, and I am determined, I am pre-positioned. It has already been determined that I will be a villain, whether I like it or not. That pun, I think, is sort of essential to the paradox of Richard's character in the play. Is he, to put it a different way, is it because he's deformed that he chooses to be a villain, or are his deformity and villainy more bound up than that? Is the deformity the outward sign of that inward villainy? Shakespeare doesn't answer that question for us, though he definitely wants us to think about it. But what does this matter? Because he wasn't actually hunchbacked and withered-armed and all those things that Shakespeare said he was. So Shakespeare's theory of Richard's character turns out to be simply mistaken. That, at least, is the gist of the coverage of the discovery of Richard III's body. In fact, I think that Shakespeare's play is a good deal more canny, and a good deal more complicated, and a good deal more interesting in the way that it explores its relationship to the past. The question of how you can know the past that lies beyond living memory. And Shakespeare's writing Richard III at a very interesting time, a time when the events of the 1480s, when Richard reigned, have relatively recently passed beyond the memory of any living person. When Shakespeare was a little boy, he might have spoken to people who actually remembered that time. By the time he's an adult writing Richard III, there's no way that anyone in England can still remember that far back. And so he's just moved, that event has just moved over a certain kind of horizon into the irrecoverable past, the past that no one can remember. And Shakespeare's play does a lot of interesting thinking about, well, how then do we know anything about that past? And some of its answers are quite skeptical. There's a scene, for instance, and this will be familiar to many of you, but I'm not assuming any particular knowledge of Richard III. There's a scene in which one of Richard's future victims, his younger nephew, Richard, Duke of York, is sort of prattling away to his mother and grandmother about the things he's heard about his uncle Richard. And he says, "Mary, they say my uncle grew so fast that he could gnaw a crust at 2 hours old." This is one of the old stories about Richard III, that he was born with teeth. So there's another excuse for me to show you the skull with the teeth. Those teeth he was supposed to have been born with. "'Twas full 2 years ere I could get a tooth. Grandam, this would have been a biting jest." His grandmother asks him, "Who told thee this?" "Grandam, his nurse." "His nurse? Why, she was dead ere thou wert born." "Well, if 'twere not she, I cannot tell who told me." It's a very strange moment in the play. It doesn't really connect to anything that happens before or after. But what it seems to be doing is, well, it's a classic case maybe of Shakespeare having his cake and eating it too. Because on the one hand, he's saying, this is another story about Richard III. He was born with teeth, with full adult teeth in his mouth already. One of the many stories about his deformity that the play seems to want to advance. But even as he does this, further creating this image of a monstrous villain, he also sort of pulls the rug out from underneath it and says, well, how do we know that? This little boy seems to remember his nurse told him that, but that Richard's nurse told him that, but Richard's nurse died before this boy was born. So where did this story come from? Has it just sort of coalesced out of nothing, out of rumor? So Shakespeare's actually interrogating the historical sources and showing that they may be built on very little foundation, even as he perpetuates the monstrous image of Richard III and makes it even worse. There are more moments like this in the play. Another one that is memorable because it involves the other brother, the other nephew of Richard III who's going to be murdered in the Tower, is when Prince Edward is talking about the Tower. He says he doesn't want to stay there. I do not like the Tower of any place, but then he starts asking about its history. Did Julius Caesar build that place, my lord? He did, my gracious lord, begin that place. Prince Edward asks, is it upon record or else reported successively from age to age he built it? That is, do we have written historical records, or is this simply a matter of oral tradition? Buckingham replies, upon record, my gracious lord. It's actually written down that Julius Caesar built it. He didn't, of course. I'm not asking you to believe that Julius Caesar built the Tower of London. Prince Edward insists, though, on the power of oral tradition. But say, my lord, it were not registered. Methinks the truth should live from age to age, as 'twere retailed to all posterity, even to the general all-ending day. So Prince Edward is this sort of naive, wide-eyed kid who wants to believe that heroic and great deeds will always be remembered and people will always want to tell the truth. And Gloucester, that is Richard, mutters to himself, so wise, so young, they say, do ne'er live long. And, of course, Prince Edward won't. So again, the idea that oral tradition, that the fame of events could somehow live on reliably is being called into question here. And finally, among these scenes that seem to cast sharp doubt on how we can have knowledge of the past that lies beyond living memory, is a solo scene in which a character called the Scrivener enters. And what he's got is the indictment of one of Richard's victims, the good Lord Hastings. And he explains that he's been writing this. This is about the 5th line down where I'm reading. 11 hours I spent to write it over, for yesternight by Catesby was it brought me. The precedent was full as long a-doing, and yet within these 5 hours lived Lord Hastings, untainted, unexamined, free at liberty. Why, who's so gross that seeth not this palpable device, yet who's so blind but says he sees it not? In other words, this is clearly, example of it's been a kangaroo court. Hastings, has only been arrested 5 hours ago, and yet the record of his arrest, his indictment, and his being sentenced to death has been under preparation for 22 hours. How is this possible? Obviously, it was all set up. This isn't this is not what, the document is not what it appears to be. If that's the case, Shakespeare seems to be inviting us to ask, how can we trust any of the documents that have come down to us from Richard III's time? Might they not all be doing some kind of political work, political chicanery, rather than mere records of the past that we can trust? Of course, any historians in the audience will know that this is a very fair question, but it's one that Shakespeare's audience, those who cared about history, would have found profoundly unsettling. So there are a lot of ways in which Shakespeare's play seems to pull the rug out from under the idea that we can have any true knowledge of the past, that the past seems to be something that's made up of rumors that we can't track down, of oral tradition that can't be relied upon, of documents that may be forged or otherwise not what they appear to be. So how does he know anything about Richard III? The play, in its searching and somewhat ironic honesty, asks that question and doesn't provide a clear answer. There are, however, in the play, a couple of images, a couple of recurring images that seem to me to hold the heart of what Shakespeare is doing with the past in this play. And they're images that actually work against each other. They're like two melodies in the play that are not in any kind of concord, that seem to contradict each other. And they're both announced in the very first lines of the play. So, images of several famous actors of the last 50 or 60 years performing that opening soliloquy. Now is the winter of our discontent. I can't resist, actually pronouncing these words. Though Anthony Sher, this fellow here, said about the opening soliloquy, you don't quite like to put it in your mouth. So many other mouths have been on it before. But I'm going to put it in my mouth. Now is the winter of our discontent made glorious summer by the sun of York, and all the clouds that lowered upon our house in the deep bosom of the ocean buried. Now are our brows bound with victorious wreaths, our bruised arms hung up for monuments, and so on and so on. And soon enough he gets to talking about how he is not shaped for sportive tricks, and so on. There are two phrases in here that set up those melodies that will recur throughout the play. They are in the deep bosom of the ocean buried, which announces a fascination with sea burial, submersion, watery graves that recurs throughout the play. And then our bruised arms hung up for monuments, the idea of arms, armor hanging like trophies on the wall, but potentially capable of being brought down from the wall. Those two images are two theories or two accounts of what happens to the past when it's over, And as I'm speaking, I'm conscious that, with the enunciation of each word, that word is over, and it's fleeing back into the past, and I can't get it back. And I'm in the midst of this sentence whose content is already mostly predetermined by the words I've already spoken and can't get back. There's this sense that you reach for it. You say, oh, I want a bit of that past back, but it's gone. The time is this and ceaselessly moving horizon. So one account of what happens to all that past is that it's just gone in the deep bosom of the ocean buried. And I'll talk a bit about that one first, because one thing that we need to remember is that for the Elizabethans, for everyone before the 20th and maybe the late 19th century, the seabed, the ocean floor, was as unattainable as the moon, except the moon's now attainable, as unattainable as Mars, or whatever our image now is going to be, the image of the thing you can't possibly reach and come back from. That image for the Elizabethans is the seabed. No one could ever go there and survive and return. So it's an image of absolute loss, absolute sundering from the world we inhabit. Now, one of the characters in Richard III, the Duke of Clarence, Richard's brother, who's also his first victim in the play, has, on the eve of his being murdered by Richard's assassins, a dream where he's crossing the ocean with Richard, and Richard stumbles and knocks him overboard. He can't quite bring himself to acknowledge that his brother wants him dead, so he dreams that his brother stumbles and knocks him overboard. And then he floats down and down and down, but he doesn't drown, he doesn't die, but he sees. Methought what pain it was to drown, what dreadful noise of waters in mine ears, what sights of ugly death within mine eyes. Methought I saw 1,000 fearful wrecks, 10,000 men that fishes gnawed upon, wedges of gold, great ouches, heaps of pearl. I did look up what ouches were, and then I forgot. I'm sorry. We'll try to look it up in the question period if we can't think of something better to talk about. But he goes on, he sees stones and jewels all scattered in the bottom of the sea. Some lay in dead men's skulls, and in those holes where eyes did once inhabit, there were crept, as 'twere in scorn of eyes, reflecting gems, which wooed the slimy bottom of the deep and mocked the dead bones that lay scattered by. Now, this is an image, of what an Elizabethan might imagine being on the seabed. Think of all those ships that have gone down, the bodies that are lost, never to be recovered for Christian burial, the treasure that's down there. So Clarence sees all this, but he sees it not only as unattainable, but as a kind of mockery, because the jewels, the gems, they are, as he calls them, unvalued. And that's a nice double meaning. It means they're sort of invaluable, they're an incredible wealth, but they're also valueless. They have no worth. Nothing can be done with them. They are gone. They are unattainable. So this is an image of the past as what's gone down to the depths and can never be recovered. And it's a very haunting and darkly beautiful image. And as I say there, I won't run through them all because this isn't that kind of lecture, but I could, spend 20 minutes saying, and here's another image of sea burial in Act 4, Scene 3. But this is the one to hold in mind. This is the sort of the piece de resistance in terms of images of watery graves in Richard III. But alongside this, there is, as I said, in the opening soliloquy, not only the deep bosom of the ocean buried, but those bruised arms hung up for monuments. And they suggested, the monument suggests a different relationship to the past. Richard is talking about how the arms and armor that people wore in the civil wars are now no longer needed, so they will hang over someone's fireplace, for another generation or another 3 generations. Armor was in fact the kind of thing, and we know this from copious numbers of wills and bequests. Armor was the kind of thing that was passed down from generation to generation as a keepsake. So it's more than likely that families of a certain status would have had, in Shakespeare's time, the armor worn by their great-great-grandfathers on Bosworth Field still moldering away in their household. Now, there's a fascinating moment in Shakespeare's play in which that armor that's been hung up for a monument is plucked down from the wall and put to use again. This is, again, I don't want to spend too much time belaboring or going into the details of the plot, but Richard and his co-conspirator Buckingham are trying to create the impression that rather than cold-bloodedly plotting the death of Hastings, they were the ones who came under attack. They had to act quickly. And in order to create the impression that they were attacked, they appear wearing this rotten old armor. On the side of the screen, you see how one of Shakespeare's sources, Thomas More, describes this. Himself, that is Richard with the Duke of Buckingham, stood harnessed in old ill-faring briganders, such as no man should ween that they would vouchsafe to have put upon their backs, except that some sudden necessity had constrained them. They just, they had no choice. They couldn't look for better armor. They had to get these monuments down from the wall, essentially, in order to protect themselves. In Shakespeare's play, this is transformed into the stage direction, "Enter Richard and Buckingham in rotten armor, marvelous ill-favored." Now, I've done a good deal of thinking and research about this armor, this kind of armor called the brigander, and I won't bore you with all of it. But the brigander is a form of leather armor with rivets or plates in it. It is a kind of armor that can actually rot, because leather can rot in a way that metal rusts. So they do appear to be wearing these briganders, this armor that was favored by both foot soldiers and in more decorated forms by courtiers in precisely Richard III's time and a few decades after that, but was decidedly old-fashioned by Shakespeare's time. So what's happening here, I think, is that when this play is performed for the first time on the Elizabethan stage in the 1590s, the actors playing Richard and Buckingham enter wearing armor that might well be, in order to be rotten, and to be the kind of armor that it is, 50 years old, or possibly 75 years old, or possibly 100 years old. That is, it is at least plausible, though there's no way of proving it, that the armor that they wore, the rotten, falling apart, old, unfashionable briganders that Richard and Buckingham, the players, wore on Shakespeare's stage, was armor that would have been new in the time of Richard III. And that creates a much more complicated idea of the relationship between performance and reality, past and present, than just the idea that the past is gone. You might think, well, this makes it authentic. Richard III performed in the authentic armor of Richard III's time. Like doing, playing Bach or whatever in authentic period instruments. This is an authentic performance because we're actually wearing Richard III's armor. It's not that simple, though, because the armor is rotten. It's showing exactly what's happened to it as a material object over the 100 years that lie between Richard III, the king, and Richard III, the play. So, if it's rotten now precisely because it is so old. It's authentic in one sense, but it's deeply inauthentic in another. It's armor that Richard and Buckingham would never have worn, given the choice. So there's a complexity about this matter, which seems, this material object, which comes before you as something that could be actually from Richard III's time, but at the same time signals clearly this can't be Richard III's time, because look at the state of that armor. It's so rotten that we have a sense of the deep gulf of time lying between one event and the other, and also of how the material object serves as a kind of bridge between them. This is almost like that handkerchief that, bring the pieces together, and one moment seems very close to another. In one way, it's doing that, but in another way, it's signaling precisely how far apart those moments still are, and all the rot and decay that lies between one and another. So, I'll wind up soon. I've talked a bit about how Shakespeare's play wrestles with the legacy, both the textual legacy and the material legacy of the past of Richard III, the past of its subject. And that was one of my notions, remember, that time is not simply linear and smooth, but can suddenly get bunched up, pleated in ways that bring moments close to each other. I had another notion, which was that stories themselves can bring things into being in what might seem paradoxical ways. And that's what I want to conclude by talking about. This takes me back, first of all, to those endless images of sea burial. Where did Shakespeare get those images of sea burial? Why are they so prevalent in Richard III? My theory, and again, this is no more than a theory, as I said, in English, we just don't have the same number of facts that other people do, or else we're just too frightened of them to announce them. But my theory is that Shakespeare was struck by the image of sea burial in an older Tudor chronicle, a chronicle by Edward Hall, that described what was done to the bodies of the princes in the Tower, who were murdered, according to the story, by Richard III. And the chronicle tells this slightly ridiculous story, as you'll see. Some say that King Richard caused the priest to take them up and close them in lead and put them in a coffin full of holes, hooked at the ends with 2 hooks of iron, and so to cast them into a place called the Black Deeps at the Thames mouth, so that they should never rise up nor be seen again. This is like a Houdini trick gone wrong. They're put into this, this coffin from which they can never emerge, and then it's sunk into the Black Deeps, this very deep part of the Thames estuary. And he goes on to say, this was the very truth, unknown by reason that the said priest died so shortly and disclosed it never to any person that would utter it. Does anyone see a problem here? So it does seem to, undercut itself, this story. How does anyone know if the priest never told anyone what happened? But be that as it may, this was a story that Shakespeare would have encountered and may have given him the cue to think about sea burial in relation to the story of Richard III and the princes. We know that other people in the 16th century did. There's an anonymous poem based on this story, which I just thought I'd show you just because I think it's kind of sweet. In London's Tower, in one place or another, interred lay King Edward and his brother. I'm sorry, I won't do the silly accent. Who by their wicked eame, that his uncle, were guiltless slain, and basely buried, yet took up again, and cast into the Black Deeps at Thames mouth. He's clearly been reading the chronicle. Now whether wrecked or tossed from north to south, their relics are, it recks not, their souls rest in heaven amongst God's children ever blessed. Oh, it's very sweet. But what this is, what this poem is telling us, and what, other sources I could show you as well, tell us, is that for the 100 years between the disappearance of the princes and Shakespeare's play, the princes become almost the paradigmatic instance of a mystery you can never solve. No one knows what happened to them. No one can recover their bodies. They are lost forever. If you want to think of something that you could never get back, you could never have the answer to, the princes in the Tower are almost the trope you would reach for automatically. That's their reputation. That's their cultural meaning in the 16th century. All of this changes not very long after Shakespeare's play, or at least after Shakespeare's after Shakespeare's play in the beginning of the 17th century, because you move from a period in the 16th century, Shakespeare's writing Richard III at the very end of the 16th century, in the 1590s, when the princes in the Tower are by definition lost and irrecoverable, and you'll never ever get them back again, to a phase of several decades in the 17th century when people just can't stop finding the princes, that they are discovered repeatedly in the Tower of London. There are numerous accounts of this, 3, possibly 4 separate discoveries of the princes in the tower over a period of about 6 decades. So the one story you find recorded in 1622 is that Richard, Duke of York, was, with his brother Prince Edward, murdered in the Tower of London, which place ever since hath been mured up, and not known until of late, when as their dead carcasses were there found under a heap of stones and rubbish. So someone in 1622 saying they were recently found under a heap of stones and rubbish. There's another account from right around this time that says that they were found at the top of a tower, but it was only one body, and the author thinks it was actually the body of an ape that had crawled up there and was mistaken for the princes. But that may be a separate discovery. Then in 1647, you get another account, but again saying this happened in the early 17th century, saying that when Sir Walter Raleigh was a prisoner in the Tower, the wall of the passage to the king's lodgings, then sounding hollow, was taken down, and at the place marked A, on a map that doesn't survive, was found a little room about 7 or 8 feet square, wherein there stood a table, and upon it the bones of 2 children, supposed of 6 or 8 years of age, which by the aforesaid noble and all present were credibly believed to be the carcasses of Edward V and his brother, the then Duke of York. So they were found within the space of in this case of about 20 years, in 2 quite separate places, one under a heap of stones and another laid out upon a table. Then in 1674, they were found again, in digging down a pair of stone stairs leading from the king's lodgings to the chapel in the White Tower. There were found the bones of 2 striplings in, as it seemed, a wooden chest, upon which the presumptions were that they were the bones of the king and his brother Richard, Duke of York. And then they were, by the command of King Charles II, put into a marble urn and deposited amongst the royal family, something that's apparently not going to happen to the bones of Richard III. But these bones that were discovered in 1674 were, in fact, deposited in an urn made by Sir Christopher Wren, which can be seen in Westminster Abbey today. Now, these stories, these multiple stories of the discovery of the bodies of the princes are fascinating. One of the things that, I guess sets the kind of work I do apart from the kind of work that the archaeologists and others at Leicester have been doing is that I'm more fascinated by the stories that aren't true and how they come into being. Clearly, not all 3 of these stories cannot be true. 2 at least of them must be false. And what's very clear about these stories is that they are all finding the princes, not just in any old place, but in significant positions that come from the stories that have been told about them. So Thomas More, again, one of the historians who writes about Richard III and his nephews, says that they were first strangled in their beds, then laid out on a table. He describes what was done with the bodies, then buried under the stairs, and then moved to another place. More tells us all this. Now, these discoveries are like snapshots of the progress of the crime. So they find them at one point on the table and at another point under the stairs. This is where I started thinking about Jorge Luis Borges and his idea of these objects that are brought into being by stories, by the belief in a narrative. Clearly, in some sense, Thomas More's story of the bodies on the table conjured bodies onto a table, and then they were found in other places that also accord with the story. I'm not saying that, at least in the final instance, some bones weren't found, but what's the motive for the search? What's the expectation of what you will find? The answers to that is that the motive for the search seems to come above all from the popularity of Shakespeare's play, and the expectation of what you will find comes from Shakespeare's play and its source in Thomas More. In other words, it's stories that are bringing these discoveries into being. You can see where I'm going, and this may be just me trying to grab my little piece of the Leicester limelight, but what has Shakespeare got to do with the discovery that's been made in Leicester last summer and confirmed today? More than we might think. Although, as I say, although the media coverage has all emphasized Shakespeare is the villain of the piece. He's the one who told lies about Richard III. He's the one who covered up the truth of this king who was not particularly hunchbacked, and might actually have been nice. That's Shakespeare's role in this narrative. But Shakespeare has another role as well, I think. It's noticeable that for the more than 100 years between Richard's burial and Shakespeare's play, there is almost no surviving reference and no indication of interest in the burial place of Richard III. It's known that he was buried at the Greyfriars, but the Greyfriars was dissolved and torn down in the 1530s. No one commented on what might have happened to Richard's body. No one seemed to be interested. It was, a fact for an antiquarian. Who cares? After Shakespeare's play, a play which ends with Richard's body still on stage and nothing being said about what's going to happen to it. This is actually very noticeable in the play because the victor, Henry Richmond, gives orders for what's going to happen to everyone else's body and pointedly leaves out Richard. So that, for instance, in the recent production at the Old Vic with Kevin Spacey, the sort of homelessness of that body was emphasized when it was winched up over the heads of the actors, sort of almost floating over the audience by its heels. And there's Richard sort of hanging upside down, this body that no one knows what to do with, this question that's hanging over the play. After Shakespeare concluded his play that way, people did start looking for Richard III. They started looking for stories about Richard III. A story emerged that he had been dug up from his grave and thrown into the River Soar. A separate story emerged of a citizen of Leicester who in the early 17th century had a monument in his garden where he said Richard was buried. But he was in competition with a pub in Leicester which had an empty coffin which they put on display, which they said was the coffin in which Richard had been buried. So very shortly after Shakespeare's play, there becomes not only a sort of a tourist industry like that bed we began the lecture by talking about, but several competing accounts, all of which could, have their own claims on tourist pennies as to what had happened to the body of Richard III. Shakespeare, in other words, starts the question that perhaps has been answered today about the fate of the body of Richard III. So his role in this story, his relation to the remains of Richard III, is more complex and I think more important than the media has sometimes made out. Anyhow, I think I've come to the end of my hour, so I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. If we do have any questions, I can run around with the mic. So if you just put your hands up, I can run and find. Any questions? We had about 20 last week. Right.
Oh, but they had facts last week, you see.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Professor. I haven't read the more history. I imagine they have different agendas because, as was pointed out on the radio bulletin this afternoon, Richard Plantagenet was a Catholic king, and Shakespeare is a kind of apologist for Tudors and the Tudor tyrant Elizabeth, I suppose one might say. More writes as a Catholic apologist. So does that sort of conflict or emerge in the play, do you think? I don't see it myself, but maybe you do.
That's a very interesting question. I think, Moore is writing his history of Richard III in the 1510s, when there is someone named Martin Luther knocking around in Germany, but there's barely a whiff of Protestantism in England at that time. So he's not yet interested in contending with that heresy as he saw it, and he takes it for granted that Richard and his enemies are all Catholic. For Shakespeare, I think that the question of what's happened to Catholic belief emerges very strongly in the play with the eruption of those ghosts at the end of the play. That one reading of the play, at least, and one that I find somewhat attractive, is that he's actually making Richard out to be a sort of proto-Protestant, someone who has turned his back on the past, turned his back on the dead. One of the big differences between Catholics and Protestants in this time is over the question of prayer for the dead, and which Protestants don't endorse. Richard has tried to, leave the dead behind him, to forget about them, to think that they are in the deep bosom of the ocean buried, but they do actually rise up as ghosts. So there is perhaps, paradoxically, for Shakespeare, Richard is a kind of Protestant king who gets his comeuppance. But don't take notes and come out and say Professor Schwyzer said Richard III was a Protestant king, because that would not be good.
Any other questions? No? Oh, go on then, sorry. Okay. Oh, hang on. I had to work my way through the crowd.
I'm not familiar with all of the historical facts that are portrayed in Shakespeare's play. Is there any evidence that, I don't know what there's about 8 or 10 deaths that take place throughout the play, that they actually happened? Do we know that all of these various characters did actually get killed during that period of history?
Yes. The characters who died did die. I mean, certainly the prominent characters who meet their ends in Shakespeare's play really were real people, and they really did die. Most of them, Richard III probably had nothing to do with their deaths. That of his brother, for instance, there's no evidence that Richard was involved in that. That of his wife, Shakespeare and other writers before him make it out that Richard had her poisoned. And in fact, when he first sees her, he says, I'll have her, but I will not keep her long. But there's no evidence that Shakespeare poisoned his wife, certainly not, that Richard had anything to do in a sinister way with his wife's death. It's almost as if in the Tudor account that Shakespeare follows, almost anyone who has the misfortune to die in the 1480s, it's sort of laid at Richard's door as another one of his victims.
Any other questions? Hold that. Okay. I need to learn to run faster, I think. What was the question? I've lost it now. Can you pass the mic along? Might be quicker.
You sort of gestured to it at the end when you talk about what happened after Shakespeare had written the play. Do you see the shift towards wanting to find a material evidence for what's happened in the past as a wider cultural change from a satisfaction maybe with oral literature or with these things that have been passed down through people, through gossip and rumour, towards a more scientific, empirical shift that maybe the 17th century is often characterised as us bringing into being? I mean, do you think, is that partly what's going on in Shakespeare's questioning of history?
I think, yeah, partly there are certainly, currents of a new sort of maybe scientific study of the past. But I think there's another story going on there that's maybe more sort of urgent in people's minds. Shakespeare's writing, some decades after one of the major cultural traumas of English history, which is the English Reformation. I'm not taking a particular view about the Reformation. I think you can take any position on it and call it a major cultural trauma, in which a lot of things went missing, including lots of bodies which were buried in monasteries, like Richard III, but thousands of others. Images, objects, and all kinds of cultural practices were suddenly either destroyed or hidden or obscured or put under a kind of veil of forgetting. So that for much of the 16th century, to show an interest in what had happened to the body of someone who died before the Reformation, the response would be, why do you want to know that? you know, what kind of interest do you have? And is it a sort of religiously healthy interest, or is this some kind of superstition? It's only when you get into the 17th century, I think, that people are far enough away from that, the Catholic past of the pre-Reformation era, that they can show an open interest in the remains of, you know, in wanting to dig around monasteries, in wanting to study objects from the medieval past without seeming like they might be, you know, crypto-Catholics. I think that's a big part of the shift that happens around the time of Shakespeare's play. But I also think his play itself starts something. That's clearly something I'm going to try to hold on to.
Thank you. Anyone else? Oh. I think you're purposefully still going to the other side of the room, aren't you? Oh, is there one down here as well? Sorry, there's a hand up down here. Oh, we'll go to you first. I'll come over to you in a minute.
Hi. A lot of the media coverage today was painting Richard III almost as the victim and sort of taking a sympathetic approach to him because there's perhaps like mistreatment of his body after his death. Mm-hmm. To what extent do you think that could influence like the teaching of Shakespeare's play as sort of like a history play and perhaps like more of a chronicle?
So could you say the last bit again?
Yeah. How do you think the today's media representations can alter the teaching of Shakespeare's play as a history play?
Well, I mean, it's not that we previously thought that Shakespeare had it right. Everybody knew this was a piece of propaganda. Most people didn't suspect that he really had all the deformities that Shakespeare said he did, or killed all the people that Shakespeare said he did. And of course, the archaeological discovery doesn't prove that he didn't kill people. What it does, as I think you were suggesting, is it draws on our empathy, maybe our pity, as one of the people involved in that press conference in Leicester was a representative of Leicester Cathedral who spoke very movingly about this as a person who died a violent death. And I think there is a way in which we, you know, beyond all the sort of historical fascination and titillation of this discovery, can be moved to empathize with, you know, someone like us, someone who had a body like us, and had some great gaping holes put in it. And I think that, in a way, that's also what, you know, you can find that in Shakespeare's play as well. It depends really on the performance. There have been great performers of the part of Richard III who have managed, maybe against the grain of the play, you might say, to really evoke the audience's pity and understanding. So I think it's going to remain something that's open to interpretation.
Cool. Where was the question down here?
Hello. What do you think the next big sort of object of search, particularly to do with sort of the redemption of Shakespeare, perhaps, will be, and how much do you think the sort of success of finding Richard's body will affect it?
Well, I mean, this is the finding of Richard's body is the sort of thing that's never supposed to happen. I mean, even some of the archaeologists involved are, you know, you can detect that they're a bit embarrassed as well as everything else, because you're not supposed to go on some sort of Indiana Jones type sort of crusade to find the king. You know, that's not what archaeologists are supposed to do. But now they've done it. It's sort of exciting, and they kind of, you can tell, would like to do it again. I think that the next step, certainly, that people in the Richard III Society will be pushing for is to open up that urn, now that they've got the DNA, to find out if those two striplings who were found under the stairs back in the 1670s are, in fact, Richard's nephews or members of the Plantagenet line, because that will answer questions as well in relation to Shakespeare's play, among others. I'm not sure what other plays by Shakespeare would also be so impacted by an archaeological discovery. There's something about this play in particular that's very interested in sort of the material traces of the past. But I don't know. I mean, they might you know, dig something up at Elsinore, and that would be relevant to Hamlet.
Okay, Brilliant. Thank you for all the questions. I think we'll leave the questions there for now. But we have got...
I've got one thing to say, is that I've been handed a card from the audience that tells me that ouches are cavities or sockets, sometimes made of gold, in which gems were set. So it's the sort of the setting for a gem, which is itself made of precious metal. Okay, so there, fact. You had a fact.
Thank you for whoever that audience member was. Okay, great clap for Philip. Thank you very much.